His eyes they closed, and his last breath spoke. He had seen all to be seen. A life once full, now an empty vase, wilt the blossoms on his early grave. Walk away, me boy, walk away, me boy, and by morning we'll be free. Wipe that golden tear from your mother dear, and raise what's left of the flag for me. Then the rosary beads, counting 1, 2, 3, fell apart as they hit the floor. In our garb of black, we must pay respect to the colour we're born to mourn. Walk away, me boys, walk away, me boys, by morning we'll be free. Wipe the golden tear from your mother dear, raise what's left of the flag for me.
The mass Irish diaspora was said to have begun in the 12th century. The English, and more specifically the British, yoke were known by the Irish, who saw them as savage tyrants and cursed intruders. The English conquest of Ireland is what had first triggered the diaspora. This invasion led to the confiscation or the transfer of Irish lands to English colonizers. By the early 1700s, the Irish owned only 14% of Ireland. Making a living as subsistence farmers, the Irish were forced to rent or lease the land from English lords. Later, the English landlords decided to make their estates more profitable. Thus, they initiated a campaign to transform the country's economy into a cattle civilization. By enclosing their estates and evicting peasant families, the English lords shifted tillage agriculture to ranching. The change from tillage to grazing meant that 90% of the laborers previously needed for planting and harvesting had become superfluous. The Irish were then left in harsh conditions, oppressed by English law, unable to earn an income, resorting to live in huts made of mud and straw, and eating a diet of potatoes and buttermilk, not to mention living in misery and fear. The reason for this Irish diaspora was on the basis of mere survival. During the 1800s, Ireland was a very agricultural land. One of their main sources of food were the potatoes. But during the late 1845s, the potato famine struck. There was a bad fungus that attacked and took over the land and ruined all the potato crops. This famine was present between 1848 to 1849. The Irish began to flee the country. One of the most popular places they left to was the U.S. and Canada, in which they took ships to. These ships were also called coffin ships. If the Irish survived the coffin ships, they came across another obstacle. Once the Irish reached the U.S. lands, they were hit hard with no Irish needed to apply jobs. They struggled to find jobs until once they had proved themselves worthy and dedicated hard workers. The population began to hurt from hunger and diseases. Due to this problem, the Irish began to flee to places such as Britain, Canada, and the U.S. This was also known as the Great Diaspora of Ireland. To this day, Ireland, since the famine, has still not been able to increase its population to the same since before it happened. According to YourIrish.com, in 1841, there was approximately 8 million population, versus today about 4.2 million. Irish still migrate yearly across the world from Ireland to other countries such as Britain, Canada, Germany, Japan, Australia, and other countries, also increasing their Irish diaspora around the world.
Life of crime was another source of the Irish diaspora. After the American Independence War, the British needed a new place for their convicts to settle. In result, they turned to Australia. In Ireland, the number one source of crime was the stealing of animals. In 1751, as many as 155 convicts were taken to Sydney, Australia, and in between 1791 and 1853, about 26,500 convicts were taken to New South Wales in ships with terrible conditions. Among these convicts was John Kelly, famous outlaw Ned Kelly's father. John and wife, like many other island citizens, were poor, which led to him stealing 2 pigs and 7 cows. He was sent to Australia along with 182 more Irish convicts on the Prince Regent ship on the 7th of August. 7 years later, he was granted his freedom, but in a whole different country, far away from what he knew as home. Following in his father's footsteps, Edward Ned Kelly turned to a life of crime. and became the famous Irish-Australian outlaw. While many consider Ned as a cold-blooded murderer, others consider him a legend and a hero for he stood up against the oppression of colonial authority. After 2 years of fighting the authority, Ned Kelly was hung in the old Melbourne jail. Even after gaining their freedom, majority of these prisoners stayed in Australia for conditions in Ireland were horrid. Australia became their new home. Today, the Irish occupy about 9% of Australia, and they have formed many Irish clubs, such as the Celtic Club, the Queensland Irish Club, Lansdowne Club, and the Irish Australian Association, and many more.
During the famine period, an estimated 500,000 Irish were evicted from their homes. Landlords used two methods to remove their tenants. The first method was by applying for a legal judgment against the male head of a family owing rent. The man would be thrown in jail and his wife and children kicked out on the streets. The second method was that the landlord would pay to send families overseas to British North America. Landlords would make phony promises of money, food, and clothing, then pack the half-naked people in overcrowded sailing ships that were poorly built. In the early 1800s, an average of 30,000 immigrants arrived annually in Quebec, the main port of entry to Canada. Approximately 2/3 of these newcomers were from Ireland. This unprecedented immigration to the St. Lawrence Valley took place during a time of major epidemic that was raging in Europe as well as in Great Britain. The disease was carried to America and Canada by migrants, many of whom were also Irish. 1 out of 5 died from the disease and malnutrition, including over 5,000 at Grosse Isle. Up to half of the men that survived the journey to Canada walked across the border to begin their new lives in America. They had no desire to live under the British North American rule. They viewed the United States with its anti-British traditions and its bustling young cities as a true land of opportunity. Many left their families behind in Canada until they had a chance to establish themselves in the US.